How do you think this sort of academic scholarship and also its increasing accessibility to lay believers will affect or influence the continued development of Salafi or post-Salafi thought?
That is a very difficult question because it's very sensitive and because there's no easy answer and because we are witnessing this in live time. It's a very difficult question. It is a question that I myself am grappling with at a personal level, at a believing level, and as an academic, and as a preacher and teacher. Without a doubt, studying Islam in the madrasa and then studying in the academy has shaped me. And I've spoken about this in a lot more detail. I have a lecture online, if you're interested. It's called Between the Madrasa and the Academy. And I go over and I highlight that there's good and bad in both. And one of our problems is that most people in the madrasa and most people in the academy are refusing to acknowledge the good of the other. And they only concentrate on the negatives of the other. And as somebody who's lived in both and is still involved to this day in both, I still attend, AMJA conferences I'm presenting and the other conferences I attend, and I still present papers, and I just published a book. This is my monograph. Had I still been in the academy, this would have got me my professorship. Alhamdulillah, I'm not in the, I don't need to do that. I resigned. I resigned because of the pressure in the academy. I resigned because I can't speak about Israel in the academy. I resigned because my morality is subjugated to public opinion and polls. I can't preach in the mosque if I'm a member of the academy. My preaching of the mosque will impact my position in the academy. That's nonsensical to the academy, but that is the reality, right? So I am not a fan of creating animosity between these two strands. I actually believe it is important that both of them recognize that each one has much to offer the other. And I speak as somebody who's traversed both of them and respects both of them. There are also areas where we're going to have to agree to disagree. And we should be brave enough to just acknowledge it and move on. The origin of the Quran is one of them. I am a Muslim. When I'm preaching and teaching, I will use the Quran as evidence. End of story. When I'm presenting an academic paper, I understand for my audience, the Quran is not an evidence. I understand this. Doesn't mean I don't believe it in my life, but I will not then use it in the same way. And I'll become third person. Well, the Quran states this. Whereas, in a lecture, I'll say, Allah says. It's the same thing, but how you phrase it and the utilization is going to be slightly different. So in some areas, we're going to have to agree to disagree. As you're aware, and I think you have in your channel interviewed such people as well, many of the modern academics love to discuss the origin of the Quran, right? Of like the parallels of other, like the Alexander story, other stories, right? And their goal here, even if it's not explicit, is very clear. Their goal is to illustrate that the Prophet was very crafty, very ingenious, that he tapped into all of these legends and then he constructed the Quran, right? That is an inherent bias of the Western Academy because they're refusing to acknowledge the theological presumption that we have. And that is, the Quran is inspiration from Allah. I believe this. And therefore, that type of talk will just not resonate with me because I'm not. So we have to agree to disagree. Hadith is another area. We're going to have to agree to disagree. There is no, now I hope there is, but as of yet, as somebody who's graduate, my undergraduate was in the College of Hadith. So I specialize.
Okay, can we stop there? Stop there, ma'am.
It is said, and I'm not just saying.
Okay, now here is something that he has to be careful of. He's making two distinctions and he's saying that they are parallel. No, they're not. He is saying that in academia will be over here, and Islamic madrasa will be over here. He's saying that these two cannot agree when it comes to Quran because they start from a different presupposition. The presupposition over here for the Muslims is this is eternal. The Quran is eternal. Therefore, it is not at all controlled by man. Man cannot manipulate it. Man cannot accrete it or delete it or corrupt it. That's their position. That's their where their starting base. On academia, he's saying they don't start from that presuppositional base. Therefore, they will never accept the eternality of it. So therefore, everything is open to criticism. And if it's man-made, it's no longer eternal. So you can see that is true, and that is a problem, and he's aware of that. What he's going to do, but however, he's going to now stipulate that the same exists for the hadith. No, it does not, because no one's stipulating that the hadith is eternal. We're all starting from the premise that the hadith, even all Muslims and Christians and non-believers believe that the hadith is written by men. It is not eternal. It is not in heaven. It is not on those eternal tablets. But he is assuming that the same problem exists with both genre of literature. No, they don't. That's where his first problem is.
My preliminary conclusion is there is no middle ground. And historical critical method and isnad analysis are two diametrically opposed ways of looking at early Islam and reports, and I don't find much commonality between them as of yet. Obviously in small areas there, but overall, two diametrically opposed epistemologies. That having been said, therefore, one will have to navigate the religious side of things if you are a believing Sunni, Hadith believer, in different epistemology. And when you are arguing in the academic world, you'll have to use a different epistemology. So in some areas, there's good, healthy overlap. In some areas, we'll politely agree to disagree. And in some areas, they're diametrically opposed. This is my preliminary analysis, and I would love to be proven wrong. And I would love for somebody to come and say, no, you are absolutely incorrect. And we can prove hadith via the historical critical method. And this is how we do it. And I would literally thank that person and be the first to buy the book and love to see it. As of yet, though, I'm a little bit pessimistic and I don't see there to be much of a commonality. So we're going to have to simply say, if you believe in that the Sunnah has been preserved by the hadith, you're going to have to follow a certain epistemology, a certain paradigm. And if you are, like, as you're aware, and you're an academic channel, right? You're well aware, nobody in the academy affirms the Muslim Sunni science of hadith. Nobody. It is considered to be completely discredited. I'm just being factual. I'm describing. I'm not saying which one is right or wrong. I'm just saying, like Harold Motsky and others are going to say, well, we can say that some hadith definitely go back to some tabi'un. Mm-hmm. That's like the max you can say. As for definitively stating that the hadith go back to the Prophet ﷺ, at this stage of my life, I will have to say, this is what I say as a believer, not as an academic.
Okay, and we call that oral tradition. That's called oral tradition. So in other words, nothing was written down by any of those persons. Not one. It's hearsay. We call another word for it be hearsay. And that's the problem. And he knows that.
As of yet, I don't think we can do that to the hadith literature. And we're just going to have to understand these are two different epistemologies. So when I become Sheikh Yasser and I go and preach and teach, I will quote Sahih Bukhari and I will quote Sahih Muslim and I will say قال الله قال رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم, and that's the preacher. And I understand in the academy I cannot quote Bukhari and this will be what the Prophet said. I understand this, so I'm just going to have to use a different epistemology. Does that answer your question? I don't know. Definitely. Yeah.
And I'm going to help you out as a Turk because you've always got on my case saying I'm always been dumping on the Turks. It's two Turkish scholars who are considered to be the world's authority on this very issue. One is Tahir Atakulic and the other one is Ekmelin Sanulu. Both of them have been very clear that there is no such thing as an Uthmanic recension. We don't have any Uthmanic Quran. I did a debate on this way back in 2014, and it's never been no Muslim has been able to shut me down on this. The six major manuscripts, the Topkapi, the Samarkand, the Ma'il, the whole Husseini, that's the Samarkand, and then with the Sana manuscript, every one of them are 8th and 9th century. Not one of them is a 7th century Quran. So that academia is very clear that none of those six, the earliest ones, are with money. And let's go to the next genre, because the next genre would be the Hadith himself. Now we're hitting the Hadith that he's talking about. Who really created what he calls the 9th and 10th century Hadith? And he claims it's all 9th and 10th century. That is incorrect. Go ahead, hit the first one. Abu Dawud actually comes from the 11th century. That's 400 years later. An-Nasai comes from the 12th century. That's 500 years later. Ibn Majah comes from the 13th century. That's 600 years. Jami' at-Tirmidhi comes from the 14th century. That's 700 years later. Sahih Muslim, look at this. The second most important comes from the 14th century. That's 700 years later. And Sahih Bukhari, the most important, the most prolific, the one that has 9 volumes, is from the 14th to 15th century. That's 700 to 800 years. Go ahead, hit the conclusion. The conclusion is not one of these hadith compilers, these 6 compilers, is from the 9th and 10th century, not their manuscripts. They may have been living there, but we don't have their manuscripts from their time period. They all were created way as late as the 11th to 15th century, which is 400 to 800 years too late. Those are the 6 that they claim. Now, notice they're very close. They're 9th and 10th century, and that's what Yusuf Qadi is talking about. That's why he says we cannot trust it because it's the 9th and 10th century. But he has no idea of what he has no idea of how erroneous that statement is. None of them. We can't find any of them. They start to appear in the 11th century with Abu Dawud, 12th century for An-Nasai, 13th century for Ibn Majah, 14th century for Tirmidhi, 14th century for Sahih Muslim, and most importantly, 14th and 15th century for Al-Bukhari. And as you said, Hatun, that's why I put them in a little bit bolder type. They are by far the most important. Notice they are according to their tradition, they are the first, right? The first 2 are Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. Actually, as far as extant manuscript is concerned, as far as history is concerned, they are the 2 last. Conclusion, as you can see, every Western and Muslim scholar believes the Hadith compilers were just 200 to 300 years old. That's bad enough. And that's where Yusuf Qadi is having a problem. That's where his dilemma is. What will he say when he finally finds out that they are really much more recent, between the 11th and 15th century? In other words, between 400 to 800 years too late. Okay, so that is the hadith that he's referring to. Now let's finish with the tariq and the tafsir, because most Muslims love the tariq and the tafsir more than anything else. And the reason why is because Al-Tabari that you have there, he's the guy that supposedly wrote it down in the 10th century. And he is the one that takes everything that everybody says, puts it out there, and it's all contradictory, and you can there sit and choose which one you want, what you want to, whatever fits your paradigm, you just grab it because Al-Tabari said so from the 10th century. That's what we've been told. No, no, no. Go ahead. The edition of Al-Tabari, which everyone uses today, was compiled by a Michael Jean de Geuge, the professor of Arabic at Leiden University, Holland, between 1879 and 1901, and is known as the Leiden edition. Actually, I've misspelled his name. It should be Goeje. Go ahead and hit the next box. I got it correct there, I think. Yeah. This de Geuge used 2 13th century Arabic manuscripts from Turkey as his model. These were written 600 years too late. So conclusion, even Al-Tabari's Tariq and his Tafsir are not 10th century originals, but are much later 13th century compilations, which were merely attributed, in other words, redacted back to Al-Tabari 300 years earlier. Yet they are still 600 years too late. What's more, it took a Dutch scholar to compile them 1,200 years later. So everything the Muslims claim comes from that time period there, right? What we're finding, it comes from that time period. I'm going to put a red wall right there between them. So everything to the left side of that red wall is a big X. Nothing at all exists from that time period. And our conclusion, we've been told that the stories surrounding Muhammad's life were written by those who saw and heard him, thus by eyewitnesses or by others within a few generations. Yet we see above that everything we know about this man Muhammad, how Islam began, the origins of Islam, were originally created 400 to 9 years after he presumably lived, yet was not canonized in most of the respects until 13 to 1200 years later, suggesting it is all a fraud. Now, let me just say something here before I go on, because I know people are going to shut back and say, hold on a minute. Are you trying to say that there was no Al-Bukhari, there was no Muslim, there was nobody living in Baghdad or Ibn Hisham? No, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying this. There could very well, and I would have no difficulty with believing that Muhammad that by the time the Abbasids, these are all Abbasid periods. Remember, 9th and 10th century is Abbasid. By the time of the 8th century, there was already a well-recognized group of people who believed Muhammad was a prophet, who believed Muhammad received a Quran, and who believed that Muhammad lived in Mecca. So by the time of the mid-8th century, that was well delegated. The difficulty is once you put a man named Muhammad who received a book of the Quran in that city called Mecca and that other city called Medina, once you say that, you've got to have documentation to support that. You need a backstory. You need to create the traditions that fill that out. And also, once you have because by that time the Quran the Quran did exist. I have no doubt the Quran existed by the mid-8th century, by the time the Abbasids come to power and move the headquarters from Damascus down to Baghdad. Once they're in Baghdad, they then have to create a backstory. That's why you have Ibn Ishaq writing the first biography in around 765. But what he wrote is not anything that was written down, because then it had to get manipulated for 70 years until Ibn Hisham wrote it down. But then when Ibn Hisham wrote it, got manipulated, and the first document we have of Ibn Hisham doesn't appear till the 11th century. And continues to the 13th, 14th, all the way up into the 16th century. So all of those we need to look together. Even Wustenfeld, when he was looking at what Ibn Hisham supposedly wrote, he refused to accept the earliest one, which is the Fed manuscript, and he threw out 75% of it, showing that even at the 11th century, by this time, the later Abbasid period, they still hadn't put together Muhammad's story. And this got then created and deleted until it was finally put together by a German scholar 160 years ago. Isn't it interesting? A European had to do the job for them. So what you do is whenever you want something that is important, you want a new law, a new institution, you put the name of someone who is a Sahaba or someone who was a Tabi'un of Muhammad. You put their name on it, and therefore it gives saying that this is what Muhammad said, this is what Muhammad did, we were right there, we saw what he did, we heard what he said, and therefore we can have authority. And in a sense, that's what Yasir Qadhi was saying tonight. He was saying, I don't have to have the original manuscripts. I knew Muhammad said this, and I know that Muhammad did this. And when I'm in the mosque and I'm in the madrasa, I put that cap on, and I refer, and you heard him say that. I there quote what Muslim said and what
Prophet said.
But when I come to academia, I don't do that because I know these guys are skeptical. So therefore, I wear a different cap, and I have to say, yes, we understand that you don't believe these guys said that. You don't believe that Muhammad said that, but I do. So he wears two different caps. He has to speak two different languages. Unfortunately for him, he has therefore gone to the latest traditions and called them to be the most authoritative. In Christianity, we don't go to the latest traditions, we throw them out. That's why we don't go to the Gospel of Thomas. We don't go to the Gospel of Judas. And we certainly don't go to the Gospel of Barnabas. They're all written too late. We go to the earliest material, that which are written by the Sahaba and by the Tabi'un. The Sahaba being Matthew and John, and the Tabi'un being Mark and Luke. We go to the original the original writers, because they were there watching what Jesus did and hearing what Jesus said. So can you see, in some ways, we're completely on opposite poles from Yasir Qadhi. And thank God we don't have to have this argument. And thank God we don't, therefore, have to rely on documents that are, in this case, 400 to 900 years so too late. Here's the next thing. Now, Hatun, here's where the rubber hits the road. What is the next time that Yasir Qadhi goes to academia? Okay, he's over here and he goes back to Yale University. And he has a talk at Yale University, his alma mater. What happens when someone raises their hand and they say, okay, Yasir Qadhi, so you do believe Muhammad did this and said this and received this and was living here. You believe this. Prove it. Prove it. Give me one reference to your prophet, Muhammad, saying or doing anything in the 7th century in Mecca and receiving this book called the Quran before 632. Prove it. Give me one reference. What is he going to do then? Can you see? This is the dilemma for him. He doesn't want to step on their toes. And to date, no one has asked that of him yet. When it comes to the historicity of Jesus and what he said and did, we are absolutely assured, not just because we can trust the accounts of the eyewitnesses and the Tabi'un, the Johns and the Marks and the Matthews and the Lukes, but we can also trust the historians that were there at that time, like Tacitus and like Josephus and like Thales and like Phlegon. Now, many people say, oh, yes, but those are much later writers. Listen, is there anybody that doubts that Jesus died on the cross? Can you show me anybody that doubts that? And can you prove it from the 7th century that there's some doubt for that? You can't. So that's why that is not in doubt. Is there any doubt that the place called Jerusalem did exist in the 1st century? Sorry, did I say 7th century? I meant 1st century. Okay, no one doubts those historical acts, and no one doubts what actually happened in the 1st century. When Yasser Qadi makes the same statement about this man named Muhammad living in a place called Mecca and receiving a book called the Quran before 632, everybody just needs to ask the same question that was asked of us. Prove it. 2 words. Prove it. But using evidence from the 7th century. You can see he has yet to answer that question. That's the one he will not answer. And that's why in some ways, he's tiptoeing around this, because he knows that he won't be able to answer that one. Look at the word he said. He said, nobody in academia affirms the Sunni Muslim science of Hadith. It is considered to be completely discredited. He's completely thrown under the bus. He's thrown the Hadith under the bus a week ago. And he has to do that because he's trying to hold both cats. And you cannot do that as a Muslim. There just is no one that credibly believes in the Hadith anymore. And when he's saying the Hadith, he means the Sirah, the Hadith, the Tafsir, and the Tariq, all 4 genres.
So then what we have here is simply when Yasser Qadi says, actually, we cannot trace Hadith back to Muhammad, he is simply correct.
That is a very difficult question.